Hello and welcome to CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films. This week, the pandemic. America first? The United States of America is the most prosperous, the most powerful country in the world, but it's also the nation that has suffered the highest number of deaths from this coronavirus pandemic. The US jobs market also seems to be suffering more than any other. So why is it that America seems unable to marshal its enormous wealth and resources to deal with COVID as effectively as other parts of the world? I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent.
And I'm Lizzy Burden, economics reporter at The Telegraph.
We'll be your guides, and if you like what we're doing, please hit the subscribe button as it helps people to find us. Joining us this week is Robert Reich, a former US Labour Secretary with the Clinton administration, who's also served under Presidents Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama. In his new book, The System, Who Rigged It, How We Fix It, he argues that the great divide in American politics isn't between right
And left, but between democracy and oligarchy.
Robert Reich, welcome to CoronaNomics.
Well, thank you very much, Lizzy.
Your book, The System, came out on the 24th of March, and you wrote it before the pandemic. So is there anything that's happened since, during the pandemic, that's changed your mind?
No, sadly, many of the trends and frameworks that are provided in the book, The System, came to full flowering, full fruition during the pandemic. In fact, the pandemic has revealed in stark reality not only the extraordinary inequality in the United States in terms of income and wealth and political power, but also how that inequality expresses itself in public health and in many other realms.
So let's get into a bit more about exactly how America has dealt with or not with the pandemic. So set the scene, let's have a look at the US death toll relative to other countries. This is from data from the European Centre for Disease Control. As you can see that USA much higher than any other country in the total death toll. Robert, I was wondering, the US is a superpower. In some ways, it's the most powerful and well-resourced administrative organization that we've ever had in history. Why, fundamentally, has it been so inept in handling this disease, do you think?
Well, Ben, first of all, the data are pretty clear. It's not just the death toll. I mean, you obviously would expect that a much larger country would have a higher death toll relative to its population, but that is really the issue. It's the death toll relative to the population, not just the death toll. And it's also the spread of the coronavirus. That is, here we are months after the first coronavirus was discovered in the United States, and we have very, very high levels relative to any other rich country. In fact, if anything, the spread of the virus continues. We are seeing increasing hospitalizations in various places around the United States. Now, why is that? I would say about 50% of the reason has to do with the incompetence of the Trump administration, the unwillingness of Donald Trump and his minions to admit the seriousness of the problem. In fact, quite the contrary. For many, many weeks, Donald Trump denied that the coronavirus was a large problem. At first, he called it a Democratic, capital D, referring to the Democratic Party, hoax. And he continued to play it down. He also gave responsibility to governors to procure all the necessary equipment in terms of ventilators, personal protective equipment. The federal government did not play any role whatsoever. And then he encouraged governors to reopen too early in terms of public places and even businesses. And what we are seeing now is the result of that ineptitude. It's ineptitude actually bordering on almost malicious negligence, because Donald Trump has tried to keep public health officials working for the government out of the public's eye. He has tried to muzzle public health officials from actually saying what they know to be the truth. I said that Donald Trump and his administration were probably 50% of the reason that the United States has had such a terrible response, really a non-response to the coronavirus. But there are also deeper issues that we can explore if you want, having to do with the United States, having to do with our safety nets, our lack of safety nets, our lack of public health, our lack of really affordable healthcare altogether. When you have 40 years in which the typical American worker does not have a raise in terms of wages adjusted for inflation, you get a lot of anger, a lot of frustration that can easily be susceptible to a demagogue peddling xenophobia and racism. And that's exactly what happened. Donald Trump came along. He was the culmination of years of neglect of the working class in the United States, years in which inequality continued to rise. You have extraordinary wealth having migrated to the top. And that wealth translates itself directly into political power because there are no constraints on how much money can be invested, if that's the right word, into politics, to bribe and corrupt politicians.
But Robert, given that the system is broken as you described, do you fear that if there'd been a Democrat in the White House, they might have struggled just as much as the Trump administration in some ways?
Well, that's why I split it 50-50, because I think that there are deep fissures, deep currents in the American system that make it difficult for any political party, any leaders, to do what needed to be done. For example, and I want to stress this, there is no paid sick leave in the United States. Now, can you imagine? I mean, how can a country deal with a pandemic if there is no ability of workers to call in sick and get paid? The unemployment insurance system is outdated. It was created in 1938 in very different circumstances during the Great Depression of the 1930s. It is and has shown itself to be completely inadequate to support people who want to stay home, who need to stay home during this pandemic. You have a healthcare system that is fundamentally broken. You don't have public health insurance. Half of Americans really don't have it. In fact, even the half that has private health insurance has to spend extraordinary sums to see a doctor or go to a hospital. So, in other words, the deck is already stacked against the public and against America when it comes to the basics you need in order to deal with a crisis of this magnitude.
Robert, I want to show you a chart. Talking of jobs, this chart shows that there was a fall of 20 million jobs in the US in April, the worst in history. But that was followed in May by the US economy adding a record 2.5 million net new jobs, which was also the highest in US history. So I wonder, isn't it in a way remarkable that the US labour market is capable of creating this glimmer of hope in the middle of such a bleak time? Isn't it the same flexibility that allows companies to fire people that actually facilitates the economy's rapid bounce back?
Yes, exactly. In other words, if you have a system that has basically employment at will, which is the legal term for the ability of companies to fire anyone, anytime, for any reason, without any rights for the employee, and you have a very small percentage of the workers who are unionized, so they can't have a voice, they can't fight back. In the United States today, only 6.4% of the private sector workforce is unionized. By contrast to much, much higher levels of unionization abroad, and even in the 1950s in the United States, you had more than a third of all private sector workers unionized. So you have a system in which there is very, very little possibility for Americans to basically stay home and protect themselves. And that, I think, it continues today. In other words, other countries, Britain and France, and particularly the Nordic countries, all of them have in place not only public health systems and health insurance systems, but also safety nets, so that, for example, governments very, very quickly moved in to pay large percentages of people's salaries so that companies would keep them at least on the job, not at home, but at least on the job, so they would not be unemployed. In the United States, we don't have that. And even when Congress responded to the pandemic, the response was not to provide a guaranteed income or at least pay 80 or 100% of employee wages, but to provide extra unemployment insurance, which overwhelmed the rickety old 1938 unemployment insurance system, making it very difficult for many people to collect unemployment insurance because those offices were just simply overwhelmed with claims.
Speaking of employment benefits, here's Donald Trump's economic advisor Larry Kudlow on CNN recently.
Should American families that are receiving these extra $600 checks right now expect that money to stop in August?
Almost all businesses, frankly, on both sides of the aisle, or mostly both sides of the aisle, understand that the $600 plus up, that's above the state unemployment benefits that they will continue to receive, is in effect a disincentive. I mean, we're paying people not to work. It's better than their salaries would get.
The average weekly payment for a laid-off worker is now $978. That's actually more than the salary of over half of full-time workers in the first quarter of this year. Whatever you or I think about what Americans were being paid before, isn't it true that the government support package presents a disincentive problem?
No, not at all, Lizzie, because we still have a huge coronavirus problem. We want people to stay home if they possibly can. That is a public health benefit, not only to the individual and his or her families, but also to everybody else. Unlike most other rich nations, we are seeing viruses and the spread of the virus continue. There is no diminution in the spread of the virus. In fact, in many states, it is increasing. We're seeing a resurgence. Nobody should be put in the position of having to return to work in unsafe conditions, and many of these workplaces are unsafe. I should add that the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which I used to supervise as Labor Department secretary in the Clinton administration, has brought only one lawsuit against employers for failing to provide safe workplaces. Well, that's ridiculous. We know from evidence that employers across America have failed to observe social safety distancing, are failing to provide personal protective equipment to their employees, are not providing safe working conditions in warehouses, in meat packing factories, and so on. So the administration itself is not even enforcing laws that would protect the health and safety of workers.
There is a lot of talk that Americans want to get back to work, but are you suggesting that a lot of Americans actually don't want to get work? It's just economic circumstances are forcing them to, or rather encouraging them to?
People want to get back to work because they've exhausted their savings. Almost 70%, in fact, some surveys show 80% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, which means that if they don't have adequate cash flow, they have no choice but to go back into often unsafe working conditions. And let me just add one other point, and that is that the Labor Department of the Trump administration has interpreted the unemployment provisions of the law now in effect to require that if an employer, no matter how unsafe the workplace, requires or requests that an employee return to work, that employee must return to work or else forfeit, in fact, will forfeit all the unemployment benefits that would normally go to that employee.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, we touched on this before, healthcare in the US context, but I think it's worth getting a bit more into it. The large US death toll and also per capita death toll, as you mentioned, how much do you think that is due to fundamental problems in the healthcare system that existed? And how much due to, as we were talking about earlier, failures of the US federal government to deliver things like ventilators, PPE, all those other things? How do you see the breakdown of the failure?
Well, as I said, and I may be being too generous to the Trump administration, but I think that at least 50% of it is due to the Trump administration's failures that have everything to do with a failure to deliver personal protective equipment and ventilators, a failure to act as a purchasing agent for states and for hospitals, a failure to simply organize what had to be a national response to the pandemic. And a failure to provide the public with accurate information. Let me also emphasize that without a public health system to begin with, without private health care, without public health insurance, without a single payer system, Americans were already very, very vulnerable. And countries like Great Britain, you have a national health service. Other countries have a single payer system, or even without a single payer system, a public health system, so that people know that they are insured if they need and have no choice but to go to hospital. That's a different system entirely. Here, we simply have never been able to summon the political ability, political will to have a total publicly insured healthcare system. And again, I want to stress that even people who do have private health insurance, they are faced with huge bills, co-payments and deductibles for going to hospital or even seeing a doctor. And so that there is a disincentive, if you think you might have coronavirus, a disincentive for checking it out.
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned the UK system of a national health service, and that's obviously where the government actually provides the care as well as the funding for the care. In the US context, you're an advocate, I believe, of a single payer system. So that doesn't go quite as far as having the government provide the health care to all citizens. Why would you stop short of that?
Well, I don't really mean to stop short of anything. I think that politically, a single payer system is more palpable than having government do all of it. But quite frankly, the public in the United States, a majority of the public, would support, according to the polls, a single payer, what's called a Medicare for all system. The problem politically is that the healthcare providers, from the hospital associations, the private providers of hospital care, to the pharmaceutical manufacturers, the drug makers, others who are threatened financially by a system that is a single payer system, because the single payer system is, frankly, cheaper. And a lot of the money is now going to hospitals and other healthcare providers and pharmaceutical makers would otherwise be saved. They don't like that. So they are a political force. And this is not new. This is even in the Obama and even before that in the Clinton administrations, they are a political force to resist any kind of a national health insurance system. In fact, I could go back all the way to the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration. I mean, the American Medical Association resisted and has continued to resist any kind of a national health system.
Yeah, it's really interesting because in the UK context, if someone was to propose a single payer healthcare insurance system, that would be regarded as hugely regressive. What are your thoughts on the sort of the differences of different countries in their approach to healthcare and provision of it for their citizens?
Well, the United States likes to talk about American exceptionalism, Ben, and you probably have heard that expression. But what we don't like to talk about is that the exceptionalism works in some very important negative ways. That is, not only do we subject Americans to huge risks and a kind of excessive individualism that means that if they get sick or if they lose their job, they're out of luck. But it also means that we don't have the kind of provision that most other rich nations have for their citizens. American workers are exposed to the harshest form of capitalism in the world. Now, we have socialism for the rich. That is, we bail out companies. In fact, even in this pandemic, big companies have been bailed out. big, Boeing and the airlines, and you have big corporations whose debts have been handled and taken over by the Federal Reserve Board. But if you are an average worker, you have nothing. There is no paid family leave. There is no paid sick leave. There is no provision for people who get into trouble or through no fault of their own. This is unique, and I want to stress this. This is unique in the industrialized world. And although we have some remnants from the 1930s, from the Great Depression, and we have a little bit of family and medical leave unpaid, 12 weeks unpaid.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you talk about the malign myths of American exceptionalism in some ways. Is there any sense of American exceptionalism that is good, that you want to see survive, that actually helps the country thrive, do you think, Robert?
Our capital markets, until very recently, have been quite flexible. So if you are an entrepreneur and you want to start something, you can do it probably more easily than you can in most other advanced countries. You have also in the United States a kind of an assumption. And that assumption is, if again, it's not just entrepreneurs, but anybody, if you want to do something, you can do it. You just go ahead and do it. You don't wait for permission. Now, that's very different from most other advanced countries where people say to themselves, well, wait a minute, maybe I need to check with the authorities before I do this because it may not be quite right. Well, that's a cultural issue with regard to the United States. I think that is very much, that's deeply embedded in American individualism. It's embedded in a culture that doesn't respect authority, doesn't really like government very much. And that may be good in many respects in terms of individual liberty and freedom. But where we get bogged down, where we don't see the downside of American exceptionalism, is in terms of these terrible kind of vulnerabilities facing average working people.
Robert, you called the election of Donald Trump in 2016. I'm wondering if you'll get your crystal ball out for us again. A few days ago, with the state of the US economy and the chaos of the Black Lives Matter protests, it seemed impossible to many that Donald Trump could be re-elected in November. But now we're seeing lots of better than expected data, the retail sales, for example. Could he actually win in November?
The polls are notoriously inaccurate because they don't tell you anything about how many people are actually going to go to the voting booths and vote. And that's the critical thing in the United States. Right now it looks like Joe Biden is leading Donald Trump by a considerable amount. It looked in 2016 as if Hillary Clinton was leading Donald Trump by a considerable amount in the polls. Joe Biden faces a structural problem, and that structural problem is that young people are not terribly excited about politics right now. In fact, if anything, they are sort of rejecting traditional politics, many of them. Progressives, and the Democratic Party has a lot of people who call themselves progressives. Those are people who do want the kind of safety nets that I've been talking about, among other things. They are not terribly excited about Joe Biden's position. They are motivated primarily by wanting to get rid of Donald Trump. Is that enough of a motivation to get them to the voting booths? Well, I'm not sure. We'll see. But there's also an X factor. We don't know to what extent Russians are going to be hacking or trying to be hacking into voting booths, voting systems. Our voting systems are not hardened against that kind of hacking. We also are seeing a lot of voter suppression around the country in terms of Republican legislators and Republican governors in some states, making it very difficult for likely Democratic voters, including many Black people and Latino people, to vote. We saw it in Georgia just recently, and that is also an unknown with regard to the upcoming election.
Robert, it's interesting. I mean, let's say Joe Biden does manage to get over the line in November. How confident are you that he would be the man to shake up this system, which needs to be fixed, as you write in your book? Or is he too much of an establishment Democrat? Do we need someone more radical to actually fix things?
In the United States, a president really doesn't lead the charge. A president gets in front of a parade, but the parade has to be going in one direction or another. Very few presidents in American history have stepped very far ahead of where the public already is. If the public wants, for example, Medicare for all, if the public wants to get rid of mass incarceration and other systems of racial injustice, if the American public is absolutely intent on reforming our unemployment system and having a public health system capable of responding to the coronavirus or a resurgence of the virus or any other future public health crisis, well, then Joe Biden will get ahead of that parade and will probably propose some very important and radical and progressive things. If the public is not there, Joe Biden probably won't.
I wonder if you're worried about the integrity of democracy. There have been attacks from Russia, voter suppression. You've said previously that America is now an oligarchy. Is it still a democracy, would you say?
A great challenge we have in front of us is whether the American democracy in terms of democratic institutions can survive not only Donald Trump, but also this extraordinary concentration of wealth and power at the top. A very famous American jurist, a justice of the Supreme Court named Louis Brandeis, said something in the former Gilded Age of the late 19th century, when the last time we had this degree of wealth and power concentrated at the top. He said, America faces a choice. We can either have huge wealth in the hands of a relatively few people, or we can have a democracy. But we can't have both. And I think what Louis Brandeis was getting at, even when he made that statement 100 years ago, was that it's very hard to maintain democratic institutions when you have an oligarchy. That is, when you have so much wealth and power in the hands of such few people that they can very easily not only bribe politicians, but also stage public relations events and investments that convince the public that the truth is not exactly what the public believes, and hoodwink the public into believing something that is not the truth.
Well, Robert, it's been a fascinating discussion. We've covered a lot of ground, from healthcare to oligarchy to the incompetence of the government to the economy and jobs market. It's been really great to talk to you. So thank you very much, Robert Reich, for appearing on CoronaNomics.
We'll be talking to many more top thinkers over the weeks ahead to discuss how we can weather the economic storm of COVID-19. So please do stay tuned and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And remember, if you like what we're doing, please do hit like, share and subscribe.
And if you'd like to talk to us, just leave us a comment below.
This has been CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films.